Hello and welcome to today's e-showcase, the dreaded data deluge, managing data and information to drive better outcomes for your utility. I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Xylem. Let's solve water. I also have the pleasure of introducing today's presenters, Stephen Pattenden and Michelle Samuels. Stephen is Global Practice Manager for Smart Wastewater Networks at Xylem. Prior to joining Xylem, Stephen headed performance, risk, and optimization operations for Thames Water in London and Southern England. In this role, he oversaw planned maintenance, asset insight, and investment into the company's large wastewater network and pumping operation. Stephen holds an MSc in water management from Cranfield University and is a chartered water and environment manager and environmentalist. Michelle is Global Practice Manager for Asset Performance at Xylem. Prior to joining Xylem, Michelle held various roles with the water industry, ranging from utility management through consulting at organizations including Stantec, the regional municipality of York, and ACOM, where she was the asset management practice lead for Eastern Canada. Michelle is a certified asset management professional, a professional engineer, and holds master's degrees in both engineering and business from the University of Toronto and Warwick Business School, respectively. And now I will turn this presentation over to Michelle and Stephen.
Thank you, Regina, and welcome to this webinar from Xylem. Today we're hosted by the Water Environment Federation, so thanks to them for hosting. We're going to discuss, investigate, and ask some questions on how data is used in water and wastewater utilities. Today we're joined by Michelle Samuels as well, and we're going to run through an introduction to utility data environments, a quick overview of current barriers to investment and investing in better data. We're going to have a discussion on how to establish frameworks to value utility data, and finally we'll present a vision of what the future might look like in an open data utility. Following that, we're going to do a quick Q&A, so please do put some questions for us in the chat, and of course use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves as we go through the webinar today. So many of you will be familiar with the Goldilocks and the Three Bears fairy tale. In this, a girl searches a bear's house for the right temperature porridge and a comfortable place to take a nap afterwards. In each instance, she tries 3 options before she finds just the right one. While this illustrates the benefit of keeping trying until you find the right option, it doesn't necessarily work when dealing in data. As we'll see, there are many significant opportunities in data that utilities hold, but they are rarely, if ever, the perfect data set. Any given problem that you can think of can probably be solved with an existing approach to data or some of the emerging techniques and approaches that we're seeing entering the industry all the time. However, there's often too much data, or there's too little. It's sometimes well structured but limited, or it's poorly structured and extensive. Perhaps it is exactly the right data, but it's of little use out of context, or without engaging it with other data from other sources. All we can say is it's never just right. So where is it all coming from? In this diagram, we've got the clean water side of the urban water cycle. So on the left, you can see the sources of water treatment across into the drinking water network. Sources of data across this operation are increasing all the time, but they're also quite well established in some areas. So understanding the operations begins with the source water on the left-hand side, where you have water quality, level, and other parameters about the water environment that are measured routinely by utilities. As we move into the water treatment facility, this is where the data deluge really begins. Operational data in these facilities is rooted in supervisory control and data acquisition systems, or SCADA, or systems that are similar to those. These are typically focused on above ground or vertical assets, and the volume that from a fully automated plant can be significant. Outside of the fence, we're seeing a proliferation of network sensors, mostly facilitated by increasing availability and decreasing cost of remote monitoring and communication options. This is leading to a revolution in water network modeling and monitoring as we transition to smart transmission and smart distribution networks. Overlaying all of these different data points are other systems as well. We've of course got work order management or CMS systems. We have GIS and spatial analytics systems. We have models and such as hydraulic models. Of course, most utilities will hold a register of their assets in some format or other. As we move into the wastewater side of the cycle, we find that this is frequently less well developed in terms of data and data generation. Again, working from left to right, we move from the customer in this instance back towards the treatment facility and ultimately back to the water environment. Here we see the biggest difference is the absence of volumetric metering or volumetric measurement of flow, as you would find within a water distribution network. These systems are open to receive flows from multiple sources, and most of those aren't measured or managed in any particular way. Wastewater networks throughout are still largely dark assets, whether they're rapidly becoming more digital and with the increasing number of network sensors deployed within them. Here, they're mostly measuring level, and a lot of that is done to support hydraulic modeling, and also to provide, on occasion, service supervision, and even we're beginning to see water quality information being derived from wastewater networks and pumping systems. In the center of the page, you see a pumping or lifting station. These are typically way more numerous in wastewater networks than they are within drinking water networks, where they're called booster stations, but they are useful nodal locations to gather network information that can represent a wider area than just the station itself. In a similar way to water production plants, wastewater treatment facilities produce huge volumes of data, and there's great potential here for optimizing performance and minimizing risk, particularly when it comes to things like pollution and environmental compliance failure. With that, we're back into the water environment. We've completed the cycle. Understanding the nature and volume of planned and unplanned discharges is becoming increasingly necessary and indeed common. But understanding the effects of these discharges on the environment is often done through sampling. Well, continuous monitoring locations are an increasingly viable option. Where they are in place, that often represent separate data environments from the networks and operations that they most closely mirror. So with that, we'll move to our first poll. So you should see a poll pop up. So I want to ask, what is the biggest source of data volume within your local utility, do you think? Or if you work in a utility, the utility you work in, is it going to be work management systems, supervision and control, or customer record management and billing? I'll give you a few moments to answer that. Okay, it just takes us a couple of seconds for the answer to pop up. There we go. Okay. So that's excellent. It does look like we have some utility data experts in the audience, as you're almost certainly correct. The most voluminous data we get is from SCADA and supervision systems, but that is changing all the time. Ultimately, higher frequency and greater density data networks are going to lead to a proliferation of data in other areas as well, away from traditional SCADA systems. So let's just look at a quick example from one utility that we know quite well. So this is an example from the wastewater network and pumping operations of a large, well-connected European utility. The volume of data generated here is huge, with each one of these numbers representing the weekly figures for this quarter of this large mixed utility. Now, what this represents is samples and changes in asset status from thousands of locations stored across numerous systems. Here you'll see, as the poll suggests, that SCADA transactions are indeed the most numerous. And these make up the bulk of the data points being generated. So this utility operates around about 16,000 different locations across this network. But coming in close second is around 4,000 locations for sewer level reading. So these give around a 15-minute reading of sewer level. So there's nearly 1 million of those being generated each week as well. Again, this demonstrates that the IoT and sensor networks are becoming more common in wastewater utilities in this particular instance. However, they're already particularly common in drinking water networks, with very high frequency measurements being the norm for things like pressure transients in water distribution and transmission networks. So the data deluge here represents another challenge in management of that data, integration, and probably most importantly, in insight generation. So let's look at this a different way. Where is this going? There's very little data coming from water utilities right now on the likely growth of data and the size of the data sets being generated. But if we look across into power networks, so globally, these networks are conceptually at least a little bit more mature than water utilities in terms of their data journey. So what can we learn about the potential data volumes from that industry? Power networks are moving towards decentralized systems governed by local demand and sophisticated forecasting models. So there's clearly an analogy here with water and wastewater operations, even in their current or legacy state. As we'll see, as they develop more and more use cases, the volume of data increases exponentially. So we can expect a similar curve from water and wastewater utilities over the coming decade. So I'll hand over to Michelle.
Excellent. So in the context of asset management planning, we see there are multiple opportunities to integrate a variety of data sets into our decision-making and financial planning. The key objective, of course, for asset management planning is to ensure that assets are fit for purpose, meaning that they're available and reliable to accomplish the objectives for which they were acquired. And we want to accomplish these objectives for the lowest life cycle cost so that we can stretch every dollar to its maximum potential. What we're seeing here is a 10-step asset management planning process that's often shared throughout the industry as a best practice for planning future funding strategies. And first, we need to take a look at understanding what assets are owned and what condition they're in. Many utilities have found this step to be challenging. However, the data contained at this level, including material, model, make, serial number, install date, and other asset characteristics, is foundational to building sustainable management and funding strategies. This is likely an area, especially around assessing condition, that we can take advantage of the data sets that we've recorded in the past. After understanding the levels of service that we're required to meet, the next step is to assess the risk and criticality of our assets so that we can best prioritize actions and management strategies that we'd like to use for our assets. Is this a low priority asset that can run to failure, or is this an asset that's too important to ever fail? Having answers to these questions is the ammunition we need to build suitable strategies for interacting with our assets moving forward. And here's a spot where we can also use, for example, in linear systems, past break data to help us understand how likely those assets are to fail, or the situational data to help us understand those consequences of failure and help us prioritize our networks. Having prioritized the assets, we can then look to the suite of interventions that help us to get the most out of our asset life cycle at minimum life cycle cost. These interventions can include assessment or inspection activities, rehabilitation or repair, mitigation activities, or finally replacement. Once we've defined those or optimized those operations, maintenance, and capital replacement strategies, we can then build our funding plans, knowing that these plans have been optimized by incorporating what we know about our assets into our decisions. So I can't stress enough that data is first principles for efficient and effective asset management planning. This is evident in all aspects related to inventory, condition, performance, and operations and maintenance. And the more reliable data that we can incorporate into our planning, the more efficient those plans will be, and the more access we have to more sophisticated analysis and decision-making techniques. Next slide, please. So before we go much further, I'd like to conduct a poll to get an understanding of where we all are on the spectrum of data integration within our utilities or organizations. The data integration maturity spectrum that we're seeing here details some key characteristics or behaviors that may be observed to describe how our organizations are functioning. At the starting point of the spectrum are organizations that are data passive. These are organizations that may have basic data collection used only for regulatory or other corporate reporting purposes. With regards to decisions around budgeting and maintenance practices, plans may be based largely on what we did last year with a flat adjustment for inflation or increased input costs. And in this paradigm, O&M and replacement plans are largely driven by budget constraints. We start with a list of known problems and complete as much as our budget will allow us to. Moving along in the spectrum are organizations that are data aware. These organizations may collect and report data related to key performance indicators that the organization has developed through strategic planning or other goal-setting activities. Any data collected over and above regulatory needs are primarily for reporting purposes internally. Budgeting and O&M decisions may incorporate data related to overall performance, but by and large are still largely based on what we did last year with similar constraints on activities limited to available budget. As we move along the spectrum, we get to the data critical organizations. These organizations are improving in sophistication for both data collection and use. They may have identified some business critical processes and developed methods to incorporate historical data into their decision making. These organizations may be on the cusp of using prioritized O&M and replacement planning to build operating and capital budgets and moving towards needs-driving budgets versus the other way around. At the high-functioning end of the spectrum are data-driven organizations. Here, data is fully integrated into business decision-making, including fully developed data governance practices with alignment to tools and processes across the organization. These organizations are very comfortable with building optimized budgets based on asset needs and focused on the asset management principles of reliability and efficiency. So take a moment to note which of these categories might best describe your organization, and we'll run our next poll. So where do you think your organization fits on the data integration scale? Your options are, I don't know, we're data passive, we're data aware, we're data critical, and we're data driven. Give you about 30 seconds to submit your response. Okay, the poll has closed, so we'll give it another few seconds for the results. And we've got probably in the area of 40 to 50% in the lower end of the spectrum. We either don't know or we're in between that data passive and data aware. And you'll be pleased to know you're in good company. That's likely where most organizations fall. Very low percentage that's really hit the high functioning level of being data driven. So that being said, we want to take a look at what are some of those barriers that are in the way of moving us towards that data driven state. And what we're seeing here is a number of elements around tools and technology, organization and culture, strategy and business use case, data governance and data accessibility and system integration that play a role in our ultimate spot on that data integration curve. Of course, these are not all inclusive elements, but these tend to be the top prospects that can bring about the most impact on our data integration capabilities. And what we've done here too is we've sort of sized these containers to reflect their impact on that organizational data integration maturity. When it comes to tools and technology, many may think that these are the greatest barriers to effective data integration, and as a result, invest a great deal of focus on implementing new software or digital technologies that will solve all their problems magically. One of the truth is, while there are many tools and software solutions to help organizations mine insights from their data, the effectiveness of these tools are greatly diminished by the quality of the data used, much like the old idiom, garbage in, garbage out. This is where factors like data governance and accessibility and systems integration play a greater role. Ultimately, they're both fundamental to how well we can apply the tools we need to leverage our data. Data governance helps us to organize the organization around questions like who owns the data? Is it reliable? Where's the single source of truth? And how do we share this data? Are there any rules around how the data can be used? Factors around accessibility and integration speaks to the myriad of software systems, sensors, and monitors that we've scattered throughout our operations and business units, and the ability to share data between them, ultimately affecting our ability to use the data. When we move on to things like organization and culture, this starts to play a larger role in data integration maturity in terms of other related business processes and practices that can impede the ability of the organization to effectively make use of its data. For example, siloed structures that don't communicate or coordinate effectively, or lack of coordinated strategic direction for the organization that could prioritize objectives for team members. Strategy and business use cases also play a large role in data integration. And here we're speaking specifically to the strategies for specific business concerns that we would like to impact using insights from the data that we've collected. Are we focused on minimizing input resources, saving money, reducing capital expenses, optimizing performance? The possibilities are varied and many. So understanding our priorities will help us to focus our efforts related to pulling together the right information and learning what we can from them. So here we have some of the elements that contribute to the effectiveness of our ability to successfully integrate data throughout the organizations. And on the left, we see some overlap, perhaps representative of entities that may be data passive or even data aware. However, the notion is that as we move towards more overlap of each of these elements, approaching a more stacked-like configuration, we approach improved levels of data integration maturity on the path towards data-driven organization. So we've gone over the barriers and understand the elements that we need to be mindful of to be successful in our data integration journey. And the question now becomes, what do we do next? How do we begin to overcome these barriers? Well, the first step is to avoid the impulse to rush out and implement the latest and greatest software tools that we've seen. In fact, the best approach is to start right where you are by identifying which business element or elements you'd like to impact and organizing further efforts around what you already have in place to support that strategy, and then build as you go to improve competencies and capabilities. So starting with the prioritized business strategy, organizations should then inventory what data is needed and already in hand to support that strategy and work towards ensuring that the data is validated and prepared for use. By this, we mean that anomalies are recognized and removed, and where possible, data has been verified as accurate. Once these steps are complete, we can take a look at tools and technologies needed to begin gleaning insights, turning on the lights, if you will, to put that data to work and start to take actions based on what we've now learned. And as we move through this process, we implement elements of continuous improvement by taking notes of obvious gaps along the way and implementing solutions for these gaps to improve performance over the next round of insights. Perhaps the largest issue faced was in data validation, indicating a need to develop a governance framework to clearly delineate roles and responsibilities and outline standard operating procedures around handling data. So repairing the gaps can touch on any of the elements that we discussed on the earlier slide, being aware of what those barriers are and what gaps we need to keep track of can help in the next iteration of gleaning insights. So moving towards a more aligned data integration system opens new doors towards the delivery of products and services that are no longer linear, but interconnected into a network structure with real-time or near real-time sharing of data for actionable insights across the organization. So we're showing some of those benefits here that we gleaned from a document developed by Deloitte. They, in fact, have a series on data supply networks that speaks towards things like predictive maintenance that you may be interested in reading, and we'll share links on some of those resources once this webinar is over. But here we can see the benefits of being able to maintain steady and useful communications with our suppliers, end users, and other stakeholders. And we can also glean financial benefits from optimizing operations and business processes to become more efficient in our service delivery. And Stephen will take you through a little bit more of that in our next segment of the discussion. Ultimately, there's a great deal of value to be recognized by improving our data integration capabilities. Now I'll turn it back over to you, Stephen.
Unmute, Stephen.
Okay. So I'll try again. So if we look around the utility-centric water cycle here, there are a number of frequently cited benefits to digitization and data utilization. Many of these you'll have heard before, or you'll have been to webinars or presentations on, or experienced conference presentations on too. I know I have. So top left is water production. We move into distribution, collection, and then treatment into the bottom left of this diagram. So in water production and wastewater treatment, so the above ground assets, the use and benefit cases are often based around reducing chemical and energy usages. These are big cost drivers there. For network businesses like water distribution and wastewater collections, the value creation opportunities are in improved asset awareness, logistic efficiency, and frequently cited again is reduced labour costs and vehicle movement. In water utilities, these benefits are often pursued individually as part of improvement programs or as individual vendor offerings. So how can we better understand the holistic nature of utility data? How can we value that? It can't just be about reducing costs. There has to be other values that digitalization can bring to water utilities, where we're likely to find added value. The sources of data in utilities are both comprehensive and varied, so there's got to be something more to it than just cost reduction for things that look large on a balance sheet. So integrating and sharing data cannot be the only measure of specific projects or individuals' features' return on investment. So globally, industry research, as depicted here, suggests there's between a 10 and 20% saving in both CapEx and OpEx, capital and operational cost. This isn't just coming from labour, chemicals, and energy. So how can we determine where this data value and these savings, as they're depicted here, are coming from at an operating or utility level? That's often the challenge for utility managers to make, is to make useful business cases for investing in integrated and complete data systems, data sets, and data acquisition processes. There's also intrinsic value that's not represented within these large OpEx and CapEx savings. So for example, cleansing, transforming, and structuring data has an intrinsic value of its very own. That's adding value to that data. Equally, linking data sets that haven't previously been linked together, or it's not been possible to do so, has significant value beyond their individual intended use. This is the classic 1 + 1 = 4 idea that we often hear when we're trying to buy software. Equally, it's impossible to price in future developments. There's no net present value of data. So when we don't know what to do with it in the future, we often undervalue it in the present. And equally, it's very difficult to value the improved collaboration and opportunities for introducing a greater diversity of thought into your operation or your asset management decision making. So it's, as Michelle said, it's about going on a data journey. It's about starting now with what you have and making best use of the data that's available to you in your utility today, finding the right partners and vendors to support your ambitions as they stand now. Another way to value data within a utility or indeed any enterprise is coming from accountancy and tax. So I borrowed this from colleagues at PwC. Again, as Michelle says, we'll share some links for some of these materials. They're quite interesting. So there are 3 ways of doing this. From the left to right, we've got looking at cost or income. So where change in revenue or the cost base of the organization can be measured, it's useful to use the method of measuring that. So you have to do that when people are using that data. If the data is simply stored in a utility, there's no point in trying to undertake this method, as simply won't have any results. There will be no change in cost or revenue as a result of the data. So it has to be being used for this to work. In the middle, we have a market. So where data is being traded directly, or similar data that we consider analogous is being traded, we can use that to establish the value of collecting and maintaining and using data within the organization. And finally, we have the cost of creating that data. So either in reproducing a copy or in creating that data again from scratch. So if we can imagine how much it might cost to create, say, a 20-year asset operation record from a major water treatment facility, maybe that's how much the data should be valued. Maybe that's its intrinsic value. Ultimately, there isn't a set way to do this. And because of the way utilities are regulated, because of the way they're funded, there isn't necessarily the drive or impetus to do this either. So again, it might be worth thinking about it in a slightly different way. Well, where can we add value to data that we hold? Now, it may be considered slightly naive or even a little bit arrogant to believe that the value added to data by integrating it and using it with other sources, finding new and novel ways to use it and to deliver performance improvement, for example, is simply the preserve of utilities and their supply chain. In this graphic, which we borrowed again, it depicts the value chain for data and creativity. So in the top left, we have the world or society, and this generates data, as you know, it has environmental data, information about people, organizations, etc. That's then passed towards data stewards in this graphic. Now, they might be utilities. They might be the owners of that data that generated it, and they may well choose to share it with different organizations. When they do that, by opening this up, they can create increased potential for growth in economic, environmental, and social value from that data. They might be finding new ways to use it or combining it, integrating it in ways that the utility or the utilities staff group could never imagine. Now, privacy concerns are undoubtedly real in this, and it's really important to acknowledge those. But we have to ask ourselves, are the benefits of opening this up to the creativity of society as a whole greater than the risks found in privacy and security concerns? So I'll open that up for our final poll of the day. So, how do you feel utilities can more readily generate value from the existing data that they hold? Should they focus on improving quality? That's things like accuracy, completeness, or consistency. Should they focus on improving interoperability, or the sort of business trope right now is breaking down their data silos? Or should they improve accessibility and transparency to their data? Should they open this data up to wider scrutiny and wider use within society? I probably should have stuck an all of those things option into this poll. I didn't, so I'm going to force you to make a choice. They all look reasonably useful and inviting to me. There you go. Okay, so we're interestingly split between, it's a tie for first between improving the quality, that's accuracy, etc. With 31% of you thought that was the way that utilities could best do this, and 31% you thought it was about improving accessibility, while improving interoperability has come in last. Now, I would have thought that might have come in first. It's one of the real focuses of utilities right now is breaking down the data silos, as I mentioned, and making data more interoperable within the utility. So that's interesting. I think that could be potentially the way forward right there. So thank you for that. But what we'll do now is we'll try and present to you what we think the future of an open data utility might look like. So if 31% of you got your way and we improved accessibility, what would the future utility look like? So I'll pass that over to Michelle to start us off with that.
Great. So now we'd like to engage your imagination and walk you through what the future could look like if we were able to fully leverage the value and benefits of utility data. We'd like to walk you through a typical day from the perspective of a data point and how that piece of information can impact our lives in a variety of ways. So let's say there was an incident overnight, a water main break, for example, that generated not only a data point, but a need for decisions to be made, actions to be taken, stakeholders to be notified, and reports to be filed, etc. Most of you will know exactly what I'm talking about. Our day starts with, let's call her Bindi. Bindi is just getting ready to start out work for the day. She reviews her mobile device, could be on her tablet or her cell phone, and takes note of what's on deck to be done. There's a couple performance flags on some pumps. She'll swing by and take a look at those to check for any funny sounds or any obvious signs of deterioration. But a notification from the pump vendor related to one of the pumps, they also received an alert from the asset and would like to schedule a maintenance visit. The vendors provided Vindy with a calendar to select a suitable date and time of available appointments, along with a list of replacement parts for order. She confirms the maintenance visit for a time that suits her and approves the parts order. Remember that water main break that happened overnight? There's a work order and incident report recorded. No action is required from Bindi, but she takes note of the details in case anything funny or interesting comes up during the day that could have resulted from the incident. And Bindi also reviews several assigned tasks from her supervisor, including verification of a few completed work orders and 4 preventative maintenance inspections that Bindi needs to complete at different locations around the plant. Bindi considers what order she'd like to tackle her work. Her app makes a recommendation, but she modifies it slightly so she can get a little extra time at lunch to fit in some mandatory training. And as she moves about the plant, she completes her work assignments, taking photos of assets, recording readings and measurements in her tablet. All of that data and information is instantly uploaded to the cloud for use throughout the organization.
Okay, so now we move over to Bindi's supervisor. I think we'll call her Mandy. This is where the data really starts going to work. Mandy goes over the events from last night. She's able to see focus reports showing only the information that she requires that needs her immediate attention or approval. No busy dashboards full of graphics and figures that she doesn't need to look at right now. There's a notification from the leak detection monitoring system indicating a potential water main break that's already been investigated and verified by the maintenance team. An emergency repair was conducted last night with minimal impact to local neighbourhoods. The team was able to proceed without any sign-off from their supervisor based on automated decision-making within the work order management system. Mandy simply notes the notifications regarding the pump performance, but sees that Bindi has already scheduled a maintenance visit and triggered the parts order that Michelle just described. Finally, Mandy looks over a summary report of other SCADA alarms that occurred overnight. The operations system identified these alarms as low risk using some predefined criteria set within the system, and automatically either cleared them away or notified a variety of operators to review and verify the outputs of those alarms. There's no additional action required from Mandy at this time, so she can concentrate on something else. So having satisfied herself that all is well with her plan, Mandy can turn her attention to the proposed budget for next month. A couple of items are off track, so she'll need to shift some activities to next month to meet her preventative maintenance plan, but also to make sure that some performance metrics that are indicating that they might require attention in the coming weeks have enough budget and resources to be attended to. She also looks over the budget recommendations and uses her applications to evaluate some different scenarios that she might need to face up to. For example, how does the risk profile of the entire water system adjust if we add or subtract proposed work? She finalizes her budget and submits it to the finance team, complete with some business cases for them to approve. At this point, it's really important we don't forget about the customers and stakeholders. The same data that was used to manage the water main break overnight is now used to send tweets and notifications to local residents who were affected. They're happy to know that the problem was resolved and that they simply slept through it with no impact to their daily lives. They're also reminded that they can go online and view water quality information from a local monitoring station, demonstrating to them and giving them the peace of mind they need to understand that there's no impact on their water supply from what happened. And then there's the regulator. Without any intervention from anybody within the utility, a report is filed and automatically received by the utility, outlining the necessary information that the utility was obliged to send them. So that concludes our story, illustrating how appropriate collection of data and data use could help utilities automate the delivery of their services and improve reliability of assets and inform optimized decision making. Each of these benefits can vastly benefit and improve efficiencies related to our people and resources, as well as stakeholder communications within a utility. I'm really excited to see if these activities become part of our everyday lives in the future. But for now, we'll have to sit and dream about this beautiful, beautiful integration. So for the last few minutes we've got left for our Q&A, I'll turn it back over to Regina to moderate that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle and Stephen. This is wonderful. We do have one question that came in from Matthew in the chat. So his statement is, our wastewater utility collects plenty of data, but we don't know how to put the data to use in an effective way. How can a wastewater plant effectively use their data?
Okay, so I'll start and I'll talk a little bit about operational performance, and I'll let Michelle give us an answer around asset management and investment. So the wastewater treatment plant is obviously simply a continuous flow of wastewater. It can be continuously optimized if you measure the right things. So there are a few key parameters that we might be able to get from an integrated data model. For example, the quality and quantity of water moving through a wastewater collection system and being lifted and moved by pumping stations. You can use that data to predict the flow that you might want to that you might get at the inlet, and then you can adjust the operation of the plant automatically to receive that flow in volume or to treat the effluent most effectively or most efficiently, thus removing some of the risk you get to compliance. Equally, you can get early warnings of process non-compliance and it drifting out of its ideal envelope of performance. There's loads of potential in real-time control and optimization. A lot of that data may well come from outside of that plan. Anything on asset investment, Michelle?
Absolutely. We talked a little bit about how we overcome some of those barriers, and the first step was to outline the business process that we wanted to have, or what we wanted to impact with that data, and understand what data we already had that could help to impact those decisions or that performance, and then put it to work. And one of the ways of helping to prioritize what specific business process we might focus on, again, Stephen comes from that framework that you presented, that help us to understand the different elements contributing to the overall performance of the business as a whole. And so using that to help prioritize what it is that we want to get better at, and then going back through that process of using what we've already gotten and improving as we go along.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. We've got a two-part question here. Other industries have made huge strides in data because it is legislated. How do we ever get to that level by trying to preach the economic operational benefits of data? Is legislation required on the utility side to get to where we want our utility data?
So that's an interesting one. Is legislation required? I'm going to attack it for a little while. It shouldn't be required, but we're operating in an industry that is risk averse. We don't have infinite resources as far as capital is concerned, right? There's a lot of stress on keeping rates low. And we have just a lot of constraints around the way we're operating. So legislation is great in really driving some of that. And I do think that it is an important element, when done wisely, that there's a lot of flexibility for utilities to be able to implement things that make the most sense for them. But, we do have some utilities that sort of lead by example. They tend to be those that have more resources at their disposal and lead the way in helping to demonstrate how we can actually benefit from some of these data integrations and digital tools and technologies. Stephen, did you have anything you wanted to add?
And there's a line here between legislation and regulation and the economics of it. So when a utility builds a tangible asset like a treatment facility, it can borrow money against that in the future to keep bills lower for bill payers and citizens. That's not the same for data. So there's a perverse incentive to build assets as opposed to there is to build data and collect better data. And that's true in the UK sector. I know it's true in the US as well. So potentially being able to tangibly value the data that they already own and then be able to build that into their balance sheets so that they're in a healthier position to invest in further data acquisition would be quite an interesting concept. Don't necessarily know how that would work, but conceptually it makes perfect sense.
All right, great. We've got one more that I think we can squeeze in before we're ending our session today. What resources should utilities access to look into learning about their data and data integration processes?
Well, I'm sure Michelle had the same experience as I did. The information available out there to write this webinar was actually quite difficult to come across. And we did a lot of research to come up with hopefully what was useful insight today. We'll send you some links to some of the stuff around valuing data. I think that's a good start. If you start to value what you already have, and you can then look at what benefit it might have in the future. That's something that's quite difficult to do, particularly if we start looking at that cost-saving only approach to valuing data. If we look at what it's likely to do for you in terms of fully integrated model in the future, you then can develop a pathway or a journey to get to that more integrated model. But really, I think Michelle's advice on starting where you are is really important. You may never get to a fully integrated data system within some organizations or utilities, but simply putting two pieces of data or two databases that have previously been orphaned from one another together can provide an immediate value. And as soon as you go on that journey, you start to find those value in places where you never thought you were going to find them before.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and put this one in there because it sounds like you may have already answered this question. But Catherine is asking, your advice, start where you're at, where we're at. We have data but don't know how to work with it. What do you recommend in terms of education and training for employees of utilities to increase their skills?
I think that's an area where you might use vendors and resources external to your organization to help provide that guidance as to how that data can be best put to use and what those benefits are. Xylem, of course, has a number of digital solutions that does some of that. But ultimately, going back to that start where you're at, it's really understanding what your organizational objectives are, what is it that you're trying to impact, and then going and taking a look at the data that you've got and how you can implement that data. It's what you've already got in hand to help you make the impact that you need organizationally.
All right, great. Well, I think that is going to take us a little over our time, but I think this was great. Michelle, Stephen, do you have any parting words? We're going to go ahead and end it here.
Just to say thank you very much to the WEF and also to all the attendees today. I think we both enjoyed presenting to you all, so thank you.
Agreed.
All right. This was great. This actually concludes today's eShowcase. Thank you all for attending. I want to take this time to thank our speakers, Stephen and Michelle, and Xylem for sponsoring today's event. This is going to include it today. The recording will be available at wefbuyersguide.wef.org. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with this link, and please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.